Okay, so why exactly do allele frequencies change and then end up giving us genetic variation? So we're going to talk really specifically right now about something called, well, we've already talked about it, microevolution. So remember, microevolution is just evolution on a small scale affecting just one population. So there are a few different mechanisms that will lead to microevolution. And so the first one is called genetic drift. We're going to get into that in just a second. The second is gene flow, and the third is sexual selection, or otherwise known as non-random mating. So let's talk a little bit more about genetic drift. Genetic drift is a term, and it means that there is a random change in the frequency of alleles of a population over time. And so rare alleles, maybe albinism, so if you're albino, you typically have an all-white phenotype. That kind of allele in a population, it usually will decrease in frequency when we see genetic drift. And so what happens in comparison is that other alleles will actually increase in frequency. So it's kind of like stomping out the minorities, if you will. And so the third thing that generally happens is the changes are usually more apparent in smaller populations. So, for example, if only the circled flowers here get to reproduce, look what could happen over time to the population. So let's say with 8 red roses and only 2 white roses. If, let's say, just for, chance purposes, these 3 are the only flowers that end up reproducing to produce offspring, this is what could happen. This is what their offspring could look like. And so we end up with 7 red roses, but we end up with 3 white roses just by chance. But let's say by chance, the only 3 roses in this generation that are able to reproduce and produce offspring are these 3 red roses. And then we would begin to see something, we would begin to see something that looks like this. We'd have a population where that white allele has been completely phased out.
And so let's say that this is our population, original population. Again, we have 10 individuals, so we have 22 total genes. But let's say those are randomized for the next group. So through sex, we get a shuffling of those genes. And so in our second generation, just due to chance, the allele frequency is going to change, or it's going to drift away from its original allele frequency. And so as we watch these being selected time after time after time, the original population is used to create the second generation, but it's the allele frequency here that sets up the third, which eventually sets up the fourth, which eventually sets up the fifth. But basically you can see that the allele frequency is starting to drift away just due to random chance. In other words, if you flip 1,000 coins, are about half of them going to be heads and half of them tails? Yeah, but if you flip 5 coins or 6 coins, are half of them going to be heads or tails? No, because chance takes over.
Yeah, for better or for worse, this is what happens. Okay, and then the second mechanism of microevolution is something called gene flow. And so gene flow is the movement of genes into or out of a population. And so this occurs during something known as migration, and it results in an increase in genetic variability of the population. And so when we think of this, I want you to think, so look down here with this beetle example. So here we have one population of these yellow beetles, and then on the right we have this other population of blue beetles. And so what do you think would happen if, so say they're on like 2 islands, okay? We got our yellow beetle island over here and our blue beetle island over there. What do you think would happen if just 1 or 2, maybe, of these blue beetles left Blue Beetle Island and traveled or migrated into this yellow beetle population, Yellow Beetle Island? And so what would happen is you would see an increase in the genetic variability of this population. So you would begin to see some different phenotypes. And if for some reason there was a factor in that environment that began to lead to the selection of the blue phenotype over the yellow, then you would begin to see natural selection occurring. Maybe the yellow beetles would not flourish as well. Or maybe they would die off in higher numbers than the blue beetles would. And so this is the second thing called gene flow that can lead to microevolution. And then the third thing that is a mechanism for microevolution is something called sexual selection, otherwise known in all scientific communities as non-random mating. So people, us, we usually select mates non-randomly to primarily cultural, and because of primarily cultural values and our social rules. Think about it this way: we don't typically just walk down the street, see somebody of the opposite sex, and then we mate with them randomly, right? That's kind of what this is saying here. Okay, so stay with me for a second. So most commonly, mating is with similar people in respect to traits such as skin color, stature, and personality. Now, is this always true? I'm just going to say it now. No, of course not. Of course we mate or share our lives with people that do not, maybe they're completely opposite to us. But this is just stating that most commonly, if you were to take 1 billion of the people on this planet, most commonly, people mate with people that are similar to them. And so, what does this do? This leads to increased percentages of homozygous genotypes in a population, either dominant or recessive. So let's think about this. Let's say I'm blonde-haired and blue-eyed. I know that both my genotypes for eye color and hair color are both recessive. But if I mate with someone who has brown hair and brown eyes, they're either homozygous dominant or they're heterozygous for both of those traits. And then I'm going to end up with offspring. They're going to be less likely to be blonde-haired and blue-eyed, right? Because I'm mating with someone that has different alleles than me. And so if then we had a child and then that child then mated with someone else that also has brown eyes, then we would see an even less amount of the blonde-haired and blue-eyed children. And so that is an example of somebody mating with someone that does not look like them. Whereas, let's now consider the fact, what if I did mate with someone that looked like me? I mated with someone that was blonde-haired and blue-eyed, right? So then we would presumably probably have children that are blonde-haired and blue-eyed. Now, let's swap out the blonde hair and blue eyes with just some lethal trait that is really undesirable, and it is a recessive trait. So you have to get 2 copies of that allele to express this really lethal, terrible disease. If we mate with someone similar in respect to these traits, then this leads to an increased percentage of homozygous genotypes in a population. And so if those alleles are present, this increase can cause some organisms to be more fit for their environment than others. We're going to see more people with that disease, and then those people are not going to be as fit for their environment. And so thus other organisms are going to begin to win out, and we are seeing more survival of the fittest. So we just talked about all that stuff that causes microevolution, right? Now, these 2 guys, so Hardy and Weinberg, were 2 scientists that came up with this weird hypothetical scenario in which there would theoretically be no changes in the allele frequencies within a population. Essentially, no evolution, no changes over time in the gene pool. We would continue to see people that look very similar to one another, and there would be no phenotype or trait that would be beating out any of the others. And this idea or concept is called genetic equilibrium. And so Hardy-Weinberg principle states that evolution will not occur if there is no natural selection. So no organism is beating out any of the others. They all have an equal shot at surviving. Second, it must be random mating. So like that weird example that I mentioned at the beginning when I said, yeah, you just walk down the street and you're like, hey, want to mate? And then you guys mate and then you have a child. That's what random mating is. So when it's random, evolution is less likely to occur, because remember, when we choose people that look more similarly to us, which is what historically we tend to do, then we increase the amount of homozygous recessive, homozygous dominant genotypes in a population, and that leads to more recessive alleles and more lethal phenotypes, and so then natural selection is acting upon us. And remember, rule number 1 was no natural selection. So no. Third, evolution will not occur if there is no migration. Then we will not see this introduction of new alleles into this population. There's nothing new happening. Okay, so that again is the third thing that will not allow evolution to occur. The fourth, because I know you're probably thinking it, but what about mutations? Well, evolution will not occur as long as there are no mutations. Again, this is a weird hypothetical scenario. This is all like theoretical. Okay, theoretical. So theoretically, if there were no mutations present in a population, evolution would not occur. And then fifth, if the population is huge, then it is going to be minimizing genetic drift.